Hey guys, what's going on? John here from What's Spinning here tonight to chat about this new surprise Fleet Foxes album, Sure. Fleet Foxes are a Seattle-based indie folk band who, I'll be honest, at first I didn't get the hype on. I wasn't listening to too much indie folk at the time and just kind of slipped by me even though people were raving about it. However, since then, I honestly have been completely not immune to their charm at all. As a matter of fact, they've become one of the most important folk bands to me in general, whether it be the super warm and rustic self-titled album, the thought-provoking introspective Helplessness Blues, or their over-the-top and completely epic and practically progressive folk album Crack Up have all been favorites of mine. The warm harmonies, the thought-provoking lyrics, the very vast atmospheres on a lot of their songs, just the warm and cozy feeling that I get from them at the end of the day, it's all been so wonderful. So here we are, 2020. Finally, we have a nice gift to us in 2020, a surprise Fleet Foxes album. Let's chat about this thing. A lot of the early tracks on this album, like Sunblind, kind of pick up exactly where Crack Up fell off. It's super breezy, it's warm, it's full of life. And let me tell you, I'm always surprised when Fleet Foxes disappear for a few years. When they do show up again, Robin Pecknell just kind of sounds just so refreshed and so full of life, and here is no different. This is absolutely gorgeous. It's so visual. It makes me want to get on the road and see things I've never seen before. Fleet Foxes absolutely have just this way of bringing so much life into their music. This is no different. I absolutely needed this right now. On the other hand, Can I Believe You brings me back to like the early days of Fleet Foxes. I love the vocal layering here and the way that Robin's vocals just eventually pierce through everything. Pacing here is nice, the atmosphere is lovely, and honestly, the vocal harmonies, especially towards the end, bring me back to a simpler time in the world of Fleet Foxes. Maybe it's just me, maybe I'm just a sucker for this, maybe it's just the timing of this coming out right around fall, just started, but this just fills me with so much joy. Now, I will say this album nearly isn't as progressive and forward-thinking as their last album, Crack Up, but I'll be honest, I don't think I needed that right now. But they make up with that with a lot of other things. For one, the production here, a lot of this album is super serene, super crisp. Tracks like Jara are just so filled with love and emotion. Robin Pecknell's writing on these tracks is incredible. It's also just filled with so much beautiful imagery. I mean, you can argue that a lot of these tracks, might not be that far out of the comfort zone of Fleet Foxes. You'd be right. But I would argue right back that there's not a folk band in the world right now that are sounding this good at this sound as Fleet Foxes is. Featherweight, on the other hand, is a sort of warm, rustic tune, the sort of sound that you would have heard in the early days of Fleet Foxes. And yeah, it might be a little bit more reserved, you're not wrong, but it's much more serene, much more pensive. There's so many more little details for you to pick out. The lyrics, the warm harmonies, the lush pianos. It is gorgeous. Not only that, but it's also the catchiest track here, probably. Now, the production on this album, as good as it is, this also leads to probably the cleanest sounding Fleet Foxes album to date. If that's something that's going to bother you, you might not dig this album as much as I am. However, if you can look past it, the songwriting here and everything else is top notch. A Long Way Past the Past is another knockout. The vocals here are just so heartwarming. Like, I swear, after all these years, they are still perfecting their harmonies, which is pretty wild. This one's a little bit more patient. It takes a while to grow. Almost has like qualities of a really great throwback soft rock tune. This is fantastic. For a week or two, honestly, once again, fans of their early days are going to want to hear this. This one is super by the books, very stripped down, but it's incredibly loving with melodies that absolutely warm your soul. I really needed this album right now. I needed an album that just made me feel good and warm and cozy. Call me crazy, but I think Fleet Foxes are the most important indie folk band in the world right now. Overall, this is an incredible album. Not perfect though, sadly. Waiting in Waist High Water as an intro, I was actually really worried hearing this that I wasn't going to like the rest of the album. Between Kevin Morby and others on vocals here, this track just doesn't seem to really go anywhere. I don't hate the instrumental, it's actually quite lovely. But this just for me isn't the track I would have started off with. And late in the album, Thymia doesn't do it for me either. It's actually my least favorite track here. It's the lightest track we've gotten in a while, and it just doesn't really resonate with me at all. The harmonies are still pretty warm and all pretty great. That's not the issue here. The issue here is, quite frankly, there is nothing on this track that I haven't heard 1,000 times better on other tracks here. But the rest of this album is quite frankly just another knockout, another masterpiece in the Fleet Foxes catalog. Maestranza actually is probably the most instantaneous track here. Not only is it overwhelmingly gorgeous, but it is overwhelmingly gorgeous from the get-go. There's some really interesting stuff going on here, from the ambient sounds that they use and the more determined riff. Got a more folk rock sound, and honestly, I love it. While this track is more straightforward, yes, it's easily good enough to be a single. And it's just so heartfelt, so passionate. Honestly, this is easily a runner-up for one of the best tracks here. I'll be honest, from the intro of Young Man's Game, I thought I wasn't going to like it. Thought it was sounding a little bit too stripped down. But it quickly becomes one of the most true-to-form Fleet Foxes tracks here. This honestly sounds like it would have been very comfortable on Helplessness Blues, even from the lyrical, more introspective standpoint. Once again, it's a little bit more upbeat, a little bit more folk rock tinged, and honestly, I think that gives it a great sound. With I'm Not My Season, honestly, Fleet Foxes are, even as this album goes on, fixing small little details that I had issues with early on in the album. For instance, this brings in the much more personal tones that we heard on Crack Up. And let me tell you, I'm just so happy to hear it. This is the lightest track here, but it's also absolutely breathtaking and just so personal and so sincere as well. I can't help but get choked up listening to this. I love Quiet Hair Gioia as well. I love the soft rock and chamber pop vibes here. The freaking drums here are epic. And hearing one harmony after another here, honestly, to me, is so intense that it's just like hearing Fleet Foxes for the first time. It also has, at least compared to the rest of the album, a lot going on here, from the sort of soulful guitar solo out of nowhere and this incredibly vast atmosphere. And Going to the Sun Road is just so picturesque. It's just, I love the horns and the woodwinds here. And if you heard some of the alternate sessions from the Crack Up sessions, honestly, you're gonna love this. Once again, this is a little out of their comfort zone. The result is super elegant, super classy, but it's just as cinematic, captivating, full of life, and life assuring as the rest of this album. Cradling Mother, Cradling Woman is freaking incredible. While the rest of this album hasn't had a lot of super long, epic performances, that's what we get here. It's just so larger than life and grandiose. It feels like a happening between the fanfare and the triumphant instrumentals and this incredibly vast atmosphere. This, to me, is what I expected a lot of this album to sound like. And sure, as the finale is pretty cool as well. It's not the usual blend of folk that we usually get from Fleet Foxes. Honestly, it's a little bit more in that chamber pop direction once again, but it's just as personal and sincere as the rest of this album. Now, no, it's not as grandiose and epic as I'd like to have had it sound, but it's far from boring. It's sweet on the ears. Some of the instrumentals that pop in towards the finale are just as fantastic and vast as the rest of this album. This album is just what I needed in 2020 right now. It's not perfect. It's not even probably the best Fleet Foxes album, but for me, right now, this has warmed my soul and captivated me to no extent. I needed this right now. I needed this in 2020. It is gorgeous. It is beautiful. It is cinematic. It is warm, and it reminds me everything that I love about Fleet Foxes and a lot of music in general. I am feeling a decent 9 on this album, but let me know what you guys think down below. If you like the video, be sure to give us a like, give us a subscribe, and let me know down below what you would like for me to chat about in the future. And until next time, have a great day, guys.